This is GARIS, Masculist MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 449, entitled Masculist Contempt for MGTOW Apolitical Wimpiness. Description. This flyer contrasts the essential differences between Masculists and MGTOWs. Masculists are fighters who aim to change society as radically as feminism did in the 70s and later, by forcing women to fip up or be severely punished by not getting a man. Masculists are intellectually armed with masculist ideas and masculist rhetoric that enable them to crush the bigotry of monoconscious feminists who have been brainwashed that gender oppression is a one-way street. Masculists argue that women have a career window of half a century, so must fip up or rot on the shelf, as masculisted men utterly reject them as immoral, manslaving parasites to be treated as vermin and wiped out by being forced to be manless, loveless, sexless, babyless and spat at. The flyer itself. Masculist Contempt for MGTOW Apolitical Wimpiness by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Often, when I watch MGTOW videos, I get frustrated. Most of these MGTOW video creators are half my age, that is, in their 20s and 30s, in brackets, I'm approaching mid-70s as I write this, June 2021, close brackets. So they have literally grown up with feminism all their short lives. So do not see feminism as a radical change in society that took off in the late 60s and early 70s, when I was already a young adult, and very aware of how drastically women's gender role changed from being a housewife, as was my mother, to being a female careerist. Feminism was one of the biggest social changes in history, allowed by modern contraception, giving women the ability to control the number of kids they wanted, which was typically 0, 1 or 2. Even with 2 kids, women had time on their hands, since men had given women science-based medicine, resulting in women having a life expectancy of 85 years, so that even those women who stayed at home for 6 years to raise their very small children still had a career window of half a century, so now have a very powerful moral obligation to fip up, that is, become FIPs, equals financially independent persons, or be severely punished by men, by masculisted men, by not getting one, thus forcing such women to rot on the shelf, manless and hence loveless, sexless, babyless, and increasingly, as masculism spreads throughout society, spat at, reviled for being immoral, parasitic, manslaving vermin. These young MGTOWs see feminism the way fish see, or rather don't see, water. That is, as so much part of their unconscious existence that they do not question it. They take feminism for granted, since it has always been there all their young lives, so do not see the enormous effort that the early second-wave feminists had to put in to get modern feminism off the ground. These second-wave feminists created a revolution that profoundly changed women's lives. As an old man, it's obvious to me, but not at all to young MGTOWs, that what women can do, men can do as well. That is, cause a radical change in men's lives by liberating men from their traditional role of being a manslave to a woman, working for a woman for decades as the unquestioned price that men have to pay to get regular sex from a woman. Masculism says that such a price is no longer necessary, since women are now careerists, or at least some of them. That women now have a career window, in brackets, that is, the period of their lives in which they can have a career, close brackets, of half a century. Hence have a powerful moral obligation to fip up by bothering to get a career competent education at high school and college, so that as an adult a woman can be a true fip, pulling her own financial weight, and not expect fluffy style, in brackets, fluffy equals a masculinist label for a traditional housewife woman, close brackets, to be able to parasite off the money and labour of a man, thus manslaving him for decades, a huge gender crime in the eyes of the masculists, which deserves major punishment. And that punishment, as administered by masculists, is that she goes manless, when most men in society are influenced by masculist ideas and refuse to be manslaved by her. If a young woman at high school gets the reputation within her social circle that she's a fluffy, then that's the kiss of death for her in terms of getting a man. Young men will see her as a future fluffy, a manslaving parasite, and spit at her, utterly rejecting her, both socially and sexually, so that her life is made utterly miserable, as no man will go near her. She will be pariahed, shunned, rejected, cast out, made to feel the gender criminal that she is, who expects to be able to parasite of the money and labour of a man for decades, a huge gender crime. Men are now intellectually armed with masculist ideas. Men are now in a position to not only challenge feminist anger at men for the ways that men oppress women, brackets, for example, rape, sexual harassment, etc., close brackets, but to beat the feminists at their own game by out-gender politically harassing feminists with masculist rhetoric by saying such things as, quote, "You women oppress men far worse than vice versa, with your, in capital letters, decades-lasting manslaving parasitism. Even rape is small beer in comparison with the hugely greater gender crime of manslaving a man for decades." For masculists, to have your masculist consciousness raised is, essentially, to see fluffydom as manslavery, and manslavery as slavery, which is a war issue to the masculists, to be hated and fought against. Masculists tell men that they no longer have to be manslaves to women, that instead men should push women very hard to fip up or be exterminated slowly by being forced to rot on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and spat at. When feminists harp publicly about how men oppress women, then all the masculists in the audience have to do is stand up and harangue them back, but with male anger, male verbal aggression, and greater male science-based intelligence, saying such things as, quote, "You women are the greater gender oppressors with your hated manslavery, your decades-lasting parasitism of men's labour and money. If you don't get off your fat parasitic asses and fip up, then you will suffer greatly. You won't get a man." We masculists are now preaching to young women that the main reason they are unable to persuade the quality men they really want to mate with, in brackets, to obtain the superior DNA from superior men for their kids, so that their kids have superior DNA compared to their mothers, which is good for the species and hence evolved, resulting in the hypergamous instinct of women that all women have, close brackets. To give these young women their sperm is that these young men refuse to run a 1 in 4 chance of having their kids ripped away from them by the hated, fluffy, feminist-controlled divorce courts, to be forced to give their ex-wife his house, half his wealth, half his stuff, be forced to pay for his kids he will barely see, And if his ex-wife is a real fluffy, be forced to pay her alimony for the rest of his life, making his ex-wife such a hated fluffy parasite that the level of hatred against her, given that she has a career window of half a century in the modern age, may get her killed as masculine soldiers go on a sex war to stop whole populations from being wiped out indirectly due to the fact that the fluffy feminists, in brackets, who want equal rights with men in the parliaments but reject equal obligations with men to share the burden of earning the living by bothering to get career competent educations at high school and college, instead preferring the intellectually easy, intellectually lazy, soft option of being what the Masculists label as fluffy crap majors, making the women who choose such inferior educations as fluffy crappers, who are seen by the Masculists as man-slaving vermin to be wiped out as hated manslavers. The divorce courts have been made so toxic for men that they have made marriage and paternity toxic for men. So in many countries now, 2/3 of young men refuse to marry, reject paternity, and choose to live the MGTOW, that's men going their own way, spending their money on themselves, lifestyle, utterly rejecting the 1 in 4 chance of losing his kids, etc. So absolutely deny giving any woman his sperm. Masculists push these panicking young women to vote with men for the men fairing of the gender laws. For example, fundamental reform in the divorce courts, where both divorcing parties, the man and the woman, are assumed to be FIPs, so that there is no halving of the wealth and assets. Each divorcing party is assumed to be financially responsible for himself, herself. Masculists push women to live the mother career timeline, that's MCT. For example, in the case of upper middle class women, she gets her master's degree at 23, works for 5 years, marries, has her first kid at 29, her second at 31. Then at 35, when her second kid is off to kindergarten, she returns full-time to her career for the next half century or so. During the 6 years that she is at home, looking after very small children, the government can pay her a motherhood wage so that the husband is not solely responsible for the financial upkeep of the family, which puts enormous stress on him, especially if he loses his job for some reason. So Masculists know that they now have an ideology, an ism, that is very powerful, powerful enough to cause major changes in society, the way that feminism did in the 70s. When Masculists hear MGTOWs passively accepting the current gender status quo, that is, with the fluffy feminists in control of the hated divorce courts, no para, that's paternity rejection right, many legal discriminations against men, etc., then Masculists become angry and impatient with the apolitical wimpiness and lack of political vision of the MGTOWs and look down on them. The essential difference between the MGTOWs and the Masculists is that the Masculists fight. They harangue and intellectually crush the MFBs, that's monoconscious feminazi bigots, who have been brainwashed for 60 years that gender oppression is a one-way street. When Masculists hear this attitude in women, they crush it with very angry Masculist rhetoric, teaching these ignorant monoconscious feminists that gender oppression is very much a two-way street, and that in fact women oppress men far worse due to women's, that is to fluffies, in capital letters, decades-lasting man-slaving parasitism. Masculists yell at monoconscious feminists who are not aware of how great a gender crime decades-lasting man-slaving parasitism is, scaring the shit out of them, threatening them with real verbal violence unless they see that fluffydom is man-slavery, that man-slavery is slavery and is hence hated. As Masculist ideas spread, and men become collectively angry at MFBs, at fluffy feminist hypocrites, and the divorce courts, at no gender equality committees that consist half of female feminists and half of male masculists, etc., then women will really start shitting their pants, because when men get really angry with their 10 times greater levels of testosterone in their blood, then women will be forced to take notice. young women particularly, will flood into STEM, that's science, tech, engineering and math, and the professions, in order to escape the collective wrath of masculisted men, who will treat fluffies with murderous hatred at being manslavers, who expect men to work for them for decades while they sit on their fat parasitic asses and live the dolce vita, spending a man's money, giving him a bit of sex from time to time, instead of getting off her ass and fipping up, pulling her financial weight, and thus being spared the murderous hatred of the masculists, who will become increasingly intolerant of fluffydom and wipe it out. If the divorce courts are not soon men-fared, the para-legislated, etc., then such a high proportion of young men, brackets probably over 90% within a decade, will have rejected marriage and paternity, that the fluffy feminists who control the divorce courts will be seen by the masculists and society as indirect genociders, since they are the indirect cause for whole populations wiping themselves out. When the very survival of societies is threatened, people go to war to stop that happening. If the gender laws are not soon men-fared, masculist soldiers will go to war to stop the fluffy feminists from wiping out whole populations. Masculist soldiers will assassinate the gender politicians who created these deeply misandrous gender laws in the first place. They will murder thousands of fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges, and if the sex war really heats up, will go out into the streets and shoot millions of fluffy feminists. Then by force, men-fare the gender laws, legislate the para, and punish severely those women who do not bother to fib up, treating them as vermin, as persona non grata, as vermin to be forced to rot on the shelf, as hated fluffies. The above, in anyone's eyes, is obviously a revolution, a masculist revolution, that must come if the gender laws are not soon men-fared. Men are waking up in their millions, soon billions, realizing that men no longer need to be manslaves to parasiting fluffies. Women have a career window of half a century, so, in capital letters, must work, or be severely punished by men, even killed by men. MGTOWs don't think in these terms.